this semester?
We have a break. I'd have to look and see when it is though here.
Just curious.
Can you send Michael an email and he replies to him, forward me whatever he says? You ask about the institutions?
No, I didn't send.
Okay, but if you do you wanna, whenever he replies, do you wanna forward it via reply?
Of course.
Thank
I'm not
you.
sure if I'm going to it, but I will.
Yeah, okay, alright. Doesn't matter when. I usually don't do my assignments when they're first assigned anyway. So.
How do you guys normally have this set up? Like,
Good morning, afternoon, hello.
hello.
How are things?
It is possible to have one.
I don't
Just
think
with
so.
all of
I
them?
don't know how to do it. Like this is the only room I Zoom in, so I have no idea. I'm trying to figure out how to put one on each screen. Because we have two TVs, like two monitors, but we don't have, like I don't know how to.
So, when Murray comes in the room and starts sharing from his computer, does that pop up on the second screen?
By the way, I'm confused.
Yes, but they go, the two cameras are going the two screens, so it is divided. What we will need is to have, in one screen, we would like to see the whole picture of all of you in Saskatoon. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I just don't know if that's possible.
Right now, it's spread out over two screens?
No, it's not spread out, and they want it to be.
Oh, okay.
In contact with both screens.
Okay.
But I don't know how to do that.
And then we can see ourselves, and we don't need to see ourselves that
I
much.
can make that smaller. That's not hard to do.
Is it because we're in a Zoom call, and until there is a third participant in the Zoom call, that your camera shot won't go away?
That's a good question.
That's perfect.
You want it like that?
Ooh, yay!
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, we get so
And then I just
excited.
want to see what happens when Marie joins.
Where is everybody?
Yeah.
Mandy, do you have to wait for him to get there to share a screen?
I do. I'll go see if he's close.
I'm just using 2 seats instead of one.
I know, I end up all sprawled
And how are you feeling?
Good,
Okay?
Yeah. I just drove up just now and the roads were like super snowy and I don't know. Well,
And how can, is there anything that helped you with the nausea and everything, or?
I
No.
think just time. Like as soon as I got to my second trimester, I was just like way better. But I never did take anything.
Yeah. Sometimes, I have heard that for some people it's useful just to smell something, like for example these essential oils that are like, mandarin is very good for nauseous when you're pregnant.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, and you?
How's your leg?
Oh,
Hi, for you.
it will be better.
Yeah. Oh. And you went to acupuncture?
I will have the appointment tomorrow.
Oh.
Yeah, I have.
You have to tell me how it goes.
I will.
Amanda.
I'm
What
looking
girl?
forward to it. You see this week is.
I thought you were just copying.
No. Not really. It's like an autoimmune system condition or something like that.
If Murray connects and it doesn't work, we just text him.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So before coming, pretty good. Like,
Amanda?
Hi, Amanda has left.
She's left. Okay, so Murray is joining. He's in his office. Does someone want to run and get her? Was there something else that you guys wanted to do with the screens to see if he starts?
I think it's good now.
Okay.
yeah. Let's see how it goes with the third party going in.
Yeah. So you can't see Murray yet? I can see your screen changing on the reflection on the screen behind you. Oh, there he is. Okay. Okay, so what are you guys seeing?
Someone wrote hi.
Okay, so that's Murray on his iPad.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's when.
So that's good.
Sorry?
As long as it goes back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where else will we go?
Where everybody else is. Did close and
Maybe they are in a different class. It's true.
Hi.
I'm not jackets.
No one in the class. It says that we are the only ones here. Excellent. Oh, because.
Because we plugged in the iPad.
Oh.
Yeah. Hopefully it goes
Oh,
back.
we can fix that.
It was big before we plugged that in.
I hate that. This thing is so stupid. Wait. Cold in here. Wow.
How are you feeling, Jude?
Good.
Good. Yeah, quite a bit better now. See that?
Now, we should only get their video when they see it. Imagine
So
I
there's
watched
nobody
it
there?
last week. Because I'm tired of watching tiny screens and comparing to hear them, and there's that banging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So loud.
90 minutes of banging, and then, just that.
Yeah, it was actually way better, like, zooming in from home, like, I could actually see things. than
Yeah,
coming here.
Joe Mark said that.
Yeah.
Like, Joe Mark was really
Yeah.
happy. Oh, I can see you on the full screen.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, this was better. One of my students was supposed to make up a quiz today. He messaged me at 12:15. I'm like, I just got in a car accident. I know you're not gonna believe me, so I'm sending a picture of myself with the car. Oh, you're right. I would not have believed you.
No, just hold on.
I got one really assignment.
Because I can't bring school.
Oh, that sucks because it wasn't.
Just hold on.
If you're not gonna wait a week and then you contact me, be like, oh, I totally forgot. Like the notifications that pop up in your courses every day.
Yeah.
Tip you off.
Yeah, that's frustrating.
Yeah, I just don't now. You have to pretty much.
You have to set a boundary though, because otherwise you're just always making exceptions for everything.
Yeah, well, I have 94 students in that one class. I don't have time.
Oh, full.
Yeah, I have 42, and that's like the most I've ever had. It's so a lot. But yeah, it's just too much. It's too much work. Sometimes I just feel like anxiety for there are too many.
Well, like, are they doing like individual assignments and everything? Oh, no, we have. I think we changed this.
Happy Valentine's Day, share.
Ooh.
What have we here anymore?
They probably have their side off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it's just one. Oh, thank you. Oh
There's
my
another.
goodness. Thank you. Here, Mike, some handmade cookies for Valentine's Day.
Oh, good
Are
thing.
you baking?
A dozen last night.
I don't know, they're X's and
They're X's and
O's.
O's with little smiley
Sugar
faces.
cookies with happy. I don't know what they are, to be fair. I bought them from Second Cup. I kind of spoke too soon for these. These are very institutional, very fascinating.
I like her.
Well, I can really feel kind of but
I like those.
I thought that thing on pivots.
What?
Pivot,
Pivot?
the chapter
Oh.
on pivots.
It just said read section 2, so that's all I did. Like, I'm not reading it because this is over my head.
Didn't he say, we're supposed to be 12 or something? Yeah, but just section 1, different section. Oh, I never understand that. I don't read it, okay. I feel like dropping into section 2, not that that would have helped. You could have just read any section.
It's big.
Another one? Oh.
Oh, no.
It does. They'll call us back. I didn't do that. I just changed it so only one video shows at a time when they speak. Because before it was all those little boxes. Hate that. This way at least it just seems to make it better. I don't remember where we started.
These filibusters, does it mean that they just keep talking and talking and talking and talking?
For hours.
Was that, so that's what it, because after you sent me, I was just reading it.
Yeah.
And I found out that there was a guy that talked for 14 hours in a row just to. Wow, that's.
Just screw people over.
And
Do you guys
then,
have that in Canada? No. No? No, we have the house and we have a speaker in the speaker.
Yeah, Tony just did.
Yeah.
You're talking about filibustering?
Yeah.
My family friend has the record for filibustering in Saskatchewan. It was years ago, but if you met this guy, you'd understand why.
At what?
The provincial legislature.
Really?
Yeah.
How long did they let them go though?
Oh, I think it was over a couple of days. I think it was a session over a couple of days.
Wow. Huh. I've never actually
Oh,
seen it
geez.
happen. No, me neither.
The last guy who did it in the States, it was for gun control.
Well, we don't want that because it's totally normal to own a business.
It's totally normal to have 5 AR-15s.
It
Totally
is.
normal.
Well, I have 7.
Yeah, target practice.
5, 7. I have a 7 car AR-15s in the basement just waiting for somebody to come by.
I was actually thinking a lot about gun control when I was reading about this, especially in just
I
groups.
think we're the only people on.
Yeah, we are. They have to call us
let's
back.
talk about the institutions then.
Yeah,
Let's start to think about our assignment. Seriously.
I-
Come back. Yes, yes.
It's like 1,200 words. So that's
Yes.
awesome.
How long is that?
It's like
Oh, 1,000 words.
Page and a half.
It's not bad.
Did you say how many of them we're getting and like how,
I think we're getting 4 of those, aren't we?
okay,
I think
so the 25 marks will be like over 4.
I have the course outline right
My
there.
first one was so
Nothing
bad.
else going on.
My first one was so bad.
Okay, problem sets
I don't remember.
are worth 25%, but does it say how many? I thought I read somewhere 4, but it doesn't say
It's not in
here.
there. I didn't know if you said all those.
But I'm a little bit confused about what is a principle and what is an institution, you know? Like,
Institutions like the ideas of a set of laws or something like that. It's not like a physical thing, but it's like, the institution of athletics or the institution of, like legislation. It's not the legislation itself. It's the idea of having legislation that defines a realm or.
but if you think about, for example, this gun control, that will have an institution behind, right?
Yeah.
And that will be.
Well, gun control itself is an institution.
Yeah.
The idea of gun control is an institution.
institutions that I used in my assignment was the set of laws that the pirates had. That they, when you read
It
that.
can be informal or formal, right? And it can be coded or not coded. It can be, you know, just,
But those are rules for our institutions.
well, rules are an institution themselves too, right?
Or rules are part of the institutions.
Yeah.
Because when you read that, it's like,
But the idea of
let's, for example,
rules.
I'm thinking about how the state is the only one that can cast enforcement, right? Like the use of the force, like legitimate use of force, that is given to the state, right?
Yeah.
That is an institution, right?
Yeah.
Well, parliamentary versus say.
Okay, everyone, welcome. I'm sorry to interrupt Regina in the middle of their conversation. We can see Regina. Regina, can you see us?
Yeah, we fixed the screen.
Excellent. Good. I'm just pulling up my screen here. All right. Good to see everyone. I don't have to run away at 3 something, so we've got right till 4 o'clock, so we'll do a standard course. Today, our standard class will break here in about an hour and a half. And we've got Irene on the on Zoom, so Irene, make sure you stick up your hand and sort of pay attention to Irene and make sure that we get her included in the conversation. And of course, we've got a group of people at Regina. Lots of readings to go through and some tough sort of concepts. I think some of you have been struggling with some of the material in some of these readings, and so my job is to get you through that and show you how it all connects together, because believe me, it does. So with that, let's jump in. If we go back to last day, we were looking at the paper, a couple of papers on institutions, Pearson, North. We haven't done Scott yet. We haven't done Moe. We took a bit of a look at Hirschman, but I'm not sure that we completely did all that we could, and we only took a very, very quick look at James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State. So let's go back and just make sure that we get some of the key ideas from some of those. Anything more we need to say about Hirschman? I think, Esther, were you doing Hirschman?
Yeah, I did the exit.
Make sure you hit the button there.
I did the first piece. The exit was at state.
Right. And who's doing? Right. Okay. So between the two of you, do you feel that we covered adequately the ideas in Hirschman? Anybody have any questions? You can, of course, come back to this, but I know as the semester rolls on, it's harder to go back. Keith, anything you want to add about Hirschman?
Nothing new from last week. I would say that, again, it's kind of that fundamental question is, what will people do in the face of challenge with the institution or the community? Will they kind of fight and use their voice, or
Right.
will they choose to leave? And
Right.
That there are kind of political considerations and economic that kind of lead to slightly different decisions.
Right. So we're going to see this exit and voice play out. We're going to particularly, I think, see the consequence of exit or lack of exit when we talk about the Moe article. So just so you get a sense that these papers do speak to some of the same ideas. Exit plays an important role, and we're going to walk through this in Mo. So we have to take a look at what is possible from exit, and whether that is an option, and see why. Hirschman starts off in Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, at least that piece that we read, saying, historically, so he's writing about the United States, Americans have looked to exit as being the key way of dealing with a decline of organizations or the state, is to exit. And that's why many of them came to the United States in the first place, is they were trying to escape from somewhere else. You need to know, this is actually really important, you need to know, does anybody know Hirschman's story? Born in Germany, he was Jewish. He was shipped off to Italy in the 1930s, just as it was becoming clear that the Nazis were starting to press in on the Jewish community in Berlin. He grew up in Berlin, and he essentially escaped. So he exited. Okay. And he was in Italy. That's where he did his. I believe that's where he did his PhD, and then eventually makes it to the United States. Again, I think fleeing from what he saw as even in Italy persecution and discrimination, and. Even in the U.S., he's unable, at least initially, to find the kind of job that he wants, and he takes a job in Colombia that actually becomes very important in terms of his writing, and then comes back to the United States and is hired into a university, and it's from there that he then writes Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Later on, Exit, Voice, and State. He writes a piece in the 1980s called The Passions and the Reasons, which is also a really excellent book. And we're going to take another little piece of look at of him, a piece that he wrote while he was probably in Italy, about Nazi Germany and about the power that they were exerting, and that's going to be in the next set of readings, or the one after that, I can't remember, but there's a couple of them coming up. When he's in Colombia, he writes some very interesting, he's got some very interesting ideas completely at odds with the prevailing ideas around development economics. Even today, his arguments around development economics don't necessarily line up with the mainstream, though the mainstream has sort of caught up to where he was. So here's a person who exhibits, and this is the point I want to make, exhibits both exit, but then also voice. So within the academic community, for instance, he feels very strongly that the views around development economics are not right. And so he sets out to really write, and this is a late 1950s piece that he writes on development. He tries to write a completely different story about how development occurs. He takes it and says the key thing about development is to give people the capacity, to develop in people the capacity to make good decisions. And he says that's where development comes from. The development of economies and communities and so forth comes from the ability of people to make good decisions. And so this is an interesting idea, because in some ways he's when he comes then later on to write Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, the voice part is people making good decisions and trying to find ways of improving the decision-making process. Whereas the exit is to say, no, I'm not participating in that. I'm going to go someplace else. Okay, and so this tension is not this is not a surprise to find in someone like Hirschman. So just a little bit of a background, but we're going to see the importance of exit. I think you'll see later on some of the importance of decision making, and certainly those of you who've taken, and this is partly for those people who are in the PhD program and have taken the decisions class, to see that there's actually a connection there as well. Okay, and so not all the stuff that we're taking in this class lines up necessarily with or 100% with other stuff in this class. Some of it is designed to line up with things in other courses, and the voice part, I think, is very, very much part of that. Okay, let's go to James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State. Who's going to kick off our discussion about that? Oh, okay. So we don't have the person who is going to kick that off. Does anybody else want to take a crack at what they found from Scott's article? Anybody? And always, maybe, less what did you get from this, and more, what's the connection of this article to other things in the other readings in the course?
Well, one of the things that he talks about, or at least the example that made the most sense to me, was when he was talking about how Germany was trying to take the most or extract the most out of the forests. And so they thought they were doing what they should to grow the best forest. So they created like vines and trees. They cleared out underbrush, like all of the things that are really important for a forest, they took away. And so they were successful for a short time, but they didn't sort of look at what was really valuable and how the forest sort of maintains itself, nor did they look down the road to see how their decision would affect the forest in the long run.
Yeah, so that's a powerful. Does everybody know what was being discussed there? This is that little vignette, if I can put it this way, about forest management practices in Germany, and what Scott says is that. And the Germans are the first ones to do this. They want to know. So what is the? Actually, let me start with this. What is the question that they want to know at the beginning? Yeah, how much revenue could we extract from these forests? These forests are an important part of revenue. How much could we extract? What's interesting, of course, is that they do, in essence, a census of the forest by being able to figure out how many trees there are of certain sizes, and it's actually quite it's a nifty little trick. They put so many whatever it was in their basket at the beginning of the day. They go out when they find a tree of a certain size. They stick of the appropriate thing in the tree, and then they come back at the end of the day and they count up how many they have left. So if they started with 100 and they have 50 left, it means that they had 50 trees of this particular size in this area, and then they know how much 50 trees of that size would generate in terms of revenue. And so they start with this. They start first of all by identifying, by, if you like, doing a census and saying this is these trees. These are the trees that would give us revenue. How many do we have? Where are they roughly located? And I say very roughly, and they would be in certain areas. And then, what was the next step in this process? And you can almost see that's kind of almost kind of this inevitable process. What's the next step? Regina? Anybody?
Pick the fastest growing tree, right?
They did do that. They picked the fastest growing trees, the ones that would give the most revenue, and then what did they start to do?
Standardized.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think they start to standardize techniques, or they try to establish new procedures so they can have more utilities, actually.
Yes. So what they did was they said, let's take these particular trees that are going to be particularly valuable. Let's grow just them in a particular site. And let's get rid of everything else because that just slows us down in terms of being able to harvest them. Let's rotate them so that we have this part of the forest coming kind of ready for harvest this year, and then the next year there'll be another part of the forest and another part of the forest, another part of the forest. And you see the pictures that he had, these long, straight sort of hallways of trees that were the result of, if you're going to plant them, don't plant them irregularly, plant them in a nice straight line, right? So the point here, and I want to take you back to the title of this. What's the title of this book? So tell me, this little story that he tells us is his way of saying this is how the state sees. What do you take from that story about how the state sees?
We can't hear you. The mics aren't on again.
I think it's more like a mind map, like trying to see, create it. It's more like a metaphor, and creating it in your mind. That's what I gathered from.
I think there's more than that. I mean, I think that's true, Esther, but I think there's more than that.
Could it be that similar to a state when they try to create policy and perhaps they're going for a particular action or they're disregarding kind of those intricate relationships or other features that are happening?
So
I shouldn't say disregarding, but unintentionally.
There is an element of this, and I want to that's the beginning of it. Can you take that further? So what you said is right, but it needs to be pushed a bit further.
So is it that they construct in their mind and try to match it physically on the land? Is that it?
Yes, that is a component of it. That they have something that they have something in their mind that they then try to recreate in the actual physical environment. And yes,
I just felt like it was more of a authoritarian state, kind of when the state has power and it, it's more of like authoritarian power when you impede your power, like you impose your power on people, but people are not actually people, but trees, and then it's like more, yes, like you said, more like metaphorical.
So it is certainly used by authoritarian regimes, and he worries about authoritarian regimes. But he, I think, is arguing that all states do this, whether they're authoritarian or not. So I think you have to be careful that you don't take his insight about what states are doing and say, oh, it just applies to authoritarian states.
No, I just thought
But
it feels like, but it's not that necessarily it is.
We can hear you, sir.
Oh, sorry. It's just I got a perception of that. It's not
so
that he's saying that.
you're right. I mean, he does talk about authoritarian states, okay, and how they might use, how their particular ways of seeing might end up having consequences. But I think the point is bigger. It applies to other states besides authoritarian ones. So I just don't want you to say, oh, this is about Scott is about authoritarian states. I don't think that's right. Okay.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it has to do with the concept of citizenship and how he goes for the uniform and homogeneous citizenship, and how the simplification of measurements depend on that, and how you sometimes, or the state homogeneize, I don't know how to say that. Well, that. The measures, and that is part of a larger emancipatory simplification for the citizens, actually.
So I didn't quite get all of that. My apologies. Let me just, I think much of what you've said is right. I'm having just a little bit of trouble of trying to connect that up with trees. Trees aren't citizens. So this is something more than just citizens. If I can, yeah.
And he talked, because one of the things that I noticed is he keeps talking about how we want to like codify and organize everything to extract as much as possible out of it. Mm-hmm. So whether it's people or land or resources on the land or whatever, that we just want to organize everything and try to extract as much as possible out of it. And we do that to the detriment of everything that we actually value.
So let me, I would argue that all of the stuff that you've said up until to the detriment of the things that we really value, I would agree with. And the reason I would take off the last bit is because we don't know what the outcome is. In the case of the forest in Germany, that was certainly the case, that it had long-term consequences that you couldn't see. It's not clear, and I think Scott says this, that some of what is done in terms of this sort of seeing like a state is actually beneficial, even in the long run. And so I think what I'm trying to do is describe the process aside from whether the effects are necessarily good or bad. We can think of a large number of bad effects, but there may also be some effects that are not so bad, or at least we need to allow that. And I'm not trying to apologize for anything. I'm just saying let's make sure that we actually understand the process first. Gab, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was thinking like the state was like trying to set up a kind of institution, a new institution, for example, how to earn more revenues by identifying resources and then like planting new trees. So isn't that kind of governing in a more systematic way and setting up like kind of institution?
Oh, sorry, I'm cutting out on Regina on this end. Your connection to institutions is important, and there is an element here of institutions. And I think we want to talk about that a little bit, because this is, I put this in at the stage where we're talking about institutions, and there's a reason for this. Let me see if I can't sort of put these things together. For me, what Scott's saying is that the state, and we can think about whether it's, he uses the example of the state. We can think about this as of corporations. I think we can see this about ourselves. Julian, I think that there are some connections to kind of modeling that you were getting at that are here, that are present. All of us, states, organizations, individuals, we will, in an effort to try to see and develop patterns and see some value in a particular object. And let's use the forest as kind of the canonical kind of idea. We will simplify this and say, this is what really matters to us. And we will focus on that. And then, as I say, almost inevitably, we will start to organize things so that those things that we had identified are pushed forward, and the things that we don't identify are pushed into the background. Okay? And I think this is something that we all do. I think it's part of the way that our minds process the incredible amount of information that we have coming in. We need to strip out a whole bunch of things, and we then focus on particular aspects. And as a consequence, we will then leave other things out of the picture. And what Scott's saying is that the state does this as well. And in fact, it's an integral part of what the state has to do, is it has to create some of these simplifications, because it is impossible for the state, and let's go to the other part of another one of his examples. It's impossible for the state to be able to keep track of all the detail that the local individuals have of that forest or the lay of the villages. I mean, he has this great description of the village and how people in the village mapped out where people were located and which land was whose land and all of that. And so everybody was given a little segment. You had a little segment here, 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 and here, and somebody else had here, 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 and here. And the people in the town knew, but somebody from the outside would never be able to figure that out. Okay, and yet you have a requirement for the state to be able to figure that out. And if you're going to put rules and stuff in place to be able to govern, you need some of that simplification. And that is the consequence of living in a world with a state present. So as long as you have a state, you will have this kind of activity going on. If we don't want the state and the beneficial things that it may bring, then fine, we can keep all that detail, very, very local, very localized knowledge. But as soon as we move to needing a state, the state is going to start to see in this particular way. It is going to give prominence to some things and not so much prominence to others.
In some ways, can you relate these kind of, I don't know if you call them background noises, I shouldn't say background noises, but all these different things that are going on outside of the economically relevant, good, big trees, could those be compared to path dependencies? Or is that, so you have this local knowledge and understanding things that are what they are,
Right.
because of past, and that kind of started the ball rolling down that, and then disregarding those and looking just at the final outcome?
No, I don't.
Or is that a bit of a leap?
I don't see the link there at all. I mean, we could discuss. I don't think that's what's.
It's a different.
I think where there is a connection is that once the state starts to see in a particular way, and I think what Scott then is suggesting is that there's different ways of seeing. Okay, so you could see the forest in one way, you could see it in a different way. Once you start seeing it in a particular way, there will be through, and now I think path dependence starts to kick in through adaptive expectations and network effects and so forth. As the state starts to see the forest in one way, then the people that could make money off of this, the people that are going to set up sawmills, the people that are going to ship the logs, say internationally, all of the people who are going to breed new trees, all of that starts to get coordinated around that particular view of the world. And that sets you off on a path that makes it very hard for you to go back and see the world in a different way. So I think that's the connection to path dependence, if that makes sense.
It does. The only other, I guess, imagine that the villagers are the ones who had created this environment of, like you mentioned, that certain norms and structures of way they do things that the state is looking in on. So you kind of have this system that's established there already. And that would have been institutions within their little realm, right? So that
correct.
Would have been, would those not have been subject as well to the path?
Absolutely.
So that's what I mean by the state's kind of looking at it and almost disregarding the path dependencies and saying,
yes,
kind of imposing and overriding them.
So if you're saying that, absolutely.
Okay. That's where I was
they're putting in a different norm of looking. And what Scott was saying is that often, in many cases, the efforts of the state to impose that view doesn't work. But then, of course, it does in some instances as well. So they are able to.
Not working would be for the same arguments why overcoming path dependency is so difficult. Not only on both ends of the coin, right? The state is seeing the difficulties trying to impose it.
Right. Anybody else? So I want you to think about this, that these ways of seeing, which for me is really about, you look at a landscape, and I'm going to take landscape in a kind of a figurative way, because it could be a human landscape, it could be a physical landscape, and there will always be a need to say on that landscape, what are the things that I'm going to pay attention to? And as soon as you do that, you start a process. Now, what I want to start to get at is that that way of seeing is in many ways an institution. Okay? And those ways of seeing will then get institutionalized and become the backdrop for how future activity is carried out, how economic activity is organized, how political activity is organized. It all starts from those ways of seeing. Now, I don't know whether Scott would take it and apply it in this way, but that's my interpretation. Now, why is this? Let me try to give you just a little bit of a sense of this. Why is this important? So, if we go back, remember kind of the big argument that we're trying to put together, or at least I'm trying to put together. It's this. We started off at the beginning of the term by asking, okay, is there if we want to think about sort of this political element and the economic element, we want to encourage activity that makes the pie, however that's kind of defined, as kind of big as possible, as much stuff, and that could be social dimensions as well as economic dimensions. We want to make that kind of as big as we can, but we're also worried about how this is going to get distributed amongst different people. And we saw at the beginning that, Coase said, gee, if you just had no transaction costs, it's kind of easy. At least you don't have to worry about the size of the pie at all. All you have to worry about is the distribution. Even then, though, we then have to worry about the distribution, and we found that, in fact, trying to come up with a way of being able to distribute that, find a social welfare function that could arise from the people that would be part of that group, we found that there's some significant problems with that. One is that there's no guarantee that the rule that you would come up would be sort of consistent with some standard things that we would want it to have, and then we also saw that that the outcome of that, whatever the mechanism, voting or market or so forth, would depend upon the rule that was actually chosen. So who got what depended upon the rule that was chosen. And then we said, well, we had another sort of nail in that coffin where we came along and said, but we're not even sure that that's what people are even thinking about when they're kind of voting and participating in civic decisions. They're not even thinking about sort of the things that we have been worried about, the size of the pie and the distribution. They're worried about shark attacks. Okay, and so now we've got kind of this real break that these things are being determined by something, and we don't have any leg sort of to stand on. So now, that was a few weeks ago. I kind of left you saying, I hope I left you feeling like you were kind of unmoored. You didn't know, okay, so how did we get the system that we have? So now I'm trying to put these things back together again, okay, and say, how do we think about a system of government and politics and economics that makes sense given what we know about the way people behave, as well as that corresponds to the theoretical models and results that we have. And in order to do this, we need a couple of building blocks. So we need institutions. Okay, we need to realize that people will be bound up with rules and norms and so forth, and that these play an important role. And seeing like a state is part of that. That what Scott is saying is that we do need to focus on particular things, and focusing on particular things will end up having particular consequences. Remember I said it was almost inevitable that once Germany started to count the number of trees of this kind, it would end up having all of its trees in a row, which would end up having a monoculture, which would end up, they didn't know that because ecology kind of came into being as a result of what they were finding along the way, but they then discovered that they had to think about the ecology of the forest rather than just those trees. So, but the key idea from Scott is that these ideas are that people will have to choose certain features to pay attention to. Okay, so we're going to park that now. And we're going to pick up on some other ideas. We think that those ideas about what to focus on in some way are connected with institutions. But now we have to see what other things institutions do. But we have a bit of a sense that those ways of seeing, those cognitive models, if we want to use North's term, are have some of the dimensions of institutions. They will be hard to change once they get established. Okay, and now we want to go back and see if there's see if we can fill in some of the other building blocks of this. So to do that, let's go to first of all, anything else on Scott that you want to say? Boy. Regina, can you still hear me? I'm having trouble catching you on my...
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, good. Next article, I think, that ties into this is W. Richard Scott and his kind of views on institutional theory. Now, there's a lot in this paper, and I don't necessarily want to go through, in fact, I don't want to go through everything. That would just take us a very, very long time. But I do want to kind of pick up some of the key ideas. So my question is, what are some of those key ideas, and who is it that's going to kick us off?
That's me.
Maritza.
Yeah, so on the Richard Scott article, I think his key argument is that he rejects the idea that some theorists have, the approach that some theorists has taken to analyze institutions being like a narrow view, or how the other Scott will say a tunnel vision in analyzing institutions. Because first, in order to be able to capture social change, researching institutions will need a broader range of time, and also to capture all three elements that he identified throughout the literature and all the theories, existing theories on institutions. And these three were the cultural, cognitive, normative, and regulative approaches. And he, besides that, he also argues that institutions need to be seen not only as a top-down, with a top-down approach, where the major institution will influence organization, and these organization systems will have to abide to the rules that the broader institution sets, but that also researchers need to acknowledge that these organizations will have an effect on the institutions and the rules that they will follow.
Yeah. So let me pick up on this last part, and you've already seen, we've already been talking about this. Scott makes a fairly, he spends a little bit of time talking about this, about the need for, he uses different terms. He uses recursiveness, and then he actually also uses endogeneity. And this all comes under this idea that agents have, or that the actors in an institutional world have some agency. So this is an important word, just to make sure everybody gets this. Everybody know this term, to have agency. What does to have agency mean? Anyone?
Will.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Self-will?
Yes, there's something a bit more, but yes, that's a part of it. Can you think about, is there another part you could add to self-will?
The ability to affect things?
Yeah, so I think you need both. I think you need to be able to not only make your own decisions, that's how I would sort of interpret self-will, the ability to make your own mind up on certain things, and then also to have a little bit of power to be able to actually, whatever you decide actually could have some impact. Because you could imagine people being able to make up, at least conceptually, people being able to make up their own mind, but they run off and they do their own thing and it has no consequence. Okay, and we would not say that those people have agency. Okay, at least I don't think that that would be the use of the word, at least in this literature. Okay, what we want is those people to be able. There's some mechanism by which what they do influences that larger system. So there's the possibility of feedback. So the institution gives rise to a certain group of people making decisions in a particular way, and that somehow either strengthens that institution or undermines it. Okay, really, those are the two things that one could have happen. And we're going to be particularly interested later on. We're going to come back to this in some of the writings by Thalen later in the term of the case where the institution gives rise to behavior that actually starts to erode the institution and change the institution. Okay, that's the one that's really that's going to be important if we want to understand how institutions might change. Because Scott starts off by saying, remember, institutions are not unchanging. They do change over time, and we have to actually understand why that's the case. Because if you go back to Pearson, that path dependence argument suggests that institutions should get stronger and stronger and stronger over time until they become completely, immutable, and that's typically not the case. So that's a really important element. Maritza, anything else to add?
Well, he adds in his article that institutional theory with when it captures all these elements is one of the key building blocks to understand institutional change and its interaction with organizations.
Right. So I want to pick up on this interaction with organizations. Does anybody want to talk about what Scott says, how institutions are connected to organizations? So institutions are kind of the rules, if you like, the rules of the game. The organizations are kind of the players. They're made up, of course, of groups of individuals. That's kind of a north view. In fact, that's pretty close to how he defines it. Scott's not saying anything that's terribly different than that. But he does talk a bit about what institutions do in terms of actually, if you like, creating organizations. Anyone? Regina? Anyone here? Okay, so this is a bit heavy, but let me see if I can. So on page 5, there's a number of places where he gets at this. But here's what he says on page 5. The key insight, however, was the recognition that models of rationality are themselves cultural systems constructed to represent appropriate methods for pursuing purposes. Okay? So models of rationality are, in fact, institutions. Okay? They're cultural systems, and they represent a method of getting to something, which really is saying, if this is a method, it's kind of a recipe, which means this is kind of a set of rules, right? That you should follow if you're going to be successful. So if you're going to bake a cake, here's the ingredients, and you can deviate a little bit, particularly if you're your grandmother and you're really good at baking cakes, you can deviate a bit. If you're not so good at baking cakes, you better stick to the recipe, or you're going to have this flat thing that you can't even play hockey with because it's so dense. And then he goes on to say, a wide variety of institutional systems have existed over space and time, providing diverse guidelines for social behavior, okay, many of which sanction quite arbitrary behavior, okay? So here's a really nifty idea that, and this is completely consistent with the stuff that we've been saying, I think. Institutional systems different institutional systems provide a different set of guidelines for social behavior. And that social behavior may be actually quite weird, okay? If looking at it in retrospect, we look back and say, gee, that was a funny norm. That was odd. Why would they do that? Now, other people will look at us and say, gee, that's a funny norm. Why are they doing that? Okay? But he says the modern world is dominated by systems embracing rationality. And these, in turn, support the proliferation of organizations. Norms of rationality play a causal role in the creation of formal organizations. So it is, if organizations are created in this institutional mix, it is because the institutions, the norms that the institutions are putting in place are ones that actually encourage organizations. Okay? If we really believe that this is a recursive system, we actually have to think about the fact that the system of institutions is in fact creating the organizations, which themselves then feed back and reinforce the institutional environment. Okay. Now, you might say, why is this important to us? Okay, because what I'm going to argue in a bit is that we now can kind of go to find out where sort of our starting point is. It is a chicken and egg kind of thing, but what we really need are, what's the starting point for how people think about things like rationality? Who are the people that put those norms in place? Okay, why did they get put in place? Who sort of was behind that? And as those norms started to kick in and supplant other norms, then we started to see a system that started to generate organizations that then would, of course, have an incentive. Once you're an organization that came out of if you like, kind of this soup of rationality, you're going to have an incentive to support rationality because that's the rules that you had figured out, and that's what your organization. That's what makes your organization work. And so you're going to be one that's going to be encouraging that back into the system.
Is it fair to say that certain institutions breed certain organizations, or is he making a blanket statement about institutions and organizations? You catch my drift, right? Like, so you could have a different set of institutions leading to a different set of organizations.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of this reminds me of the Frankfurt School, and Adorno, Marcuse, and Habermas talked a lot about rationality and instrumental rationality coming out of the war, post-war period, and how that they viewed it as very destructive, of course, because it led to this war pattern. Just back to your example, how we can see things retrospectively as problematic, and at the time it seems sensitive.
So you can see, with this kind of background, you can see why I gave you the question for your second assignment, getting you to think about how an idea, a cultural idea, might be through Pearson's, and they're from Arthur, but Pearson's 4 elements that give rise to increasing returns. Okay, so just so you can see that this is an attempt to try to link up that argument a bit. One of the other things, for those of you who end up doing research on institutions over time, he has on page 22 a nice little statement. He says, in tracking institutional change empirically, we found it advisable to focus on three measurable components. Who are the types of actors, okay? Or the organization, or the organizing models, a combination of cultural, cognitive, and normative elements, institutional logics, primarily cultural cognitive elements, and governance structures, combination of regulatory and normative elements, to go back to the three elements that Maritza had pointed out. But actually he gives you, and if you go take a look at those references, if you're actually trying to do some empirical work about institutions, though Scott's saying those are the three things to look at. Who are your actors? You have to understand those people. You have to understand the institutional logics that they have. These are really norms of behavior, and some of them are normative. That this is what's good to do, proper to do, moral to do, and some of them are just kind of. How can I put this? They reflect a belief system about how the world works. If you believe the world works this way, then such and such a thing is the right way to do this. Just to give you a bit of a sense of an institutional logic, there's a lot of work being done in business organizations on institutional logics. For some of that work is being done, and one of the areas, and in fact, one of the master's students here, Kathy Johnson, a few years ago with Dion Pooler, when Dion was here, did a study of institutional logics in the credit union system. And she looked at a couple of credit unions and looked to see whether there were different institutional logics that were actually in conflict within the credit union. One of them was a profit maximization kind of logic, and another one was something about trying to be of service to your community and providing service to a wide group of people. These are two, I can expand upon this, but these are two different institutional logics. Okay, and how do they then play out? What's the tension between these? Does one come to the fore, to the surface, and dominate, or do they both coexist in some kind of fashion? Okay, this is stuff that people are actually doing work on. Some of it here at the JSGS. Any other questions about Scott?
I have one, Marie. I feel like I'm missing something that probably early on in this article, but I don't quite understand what the norms of rationality are.
Say that again?
I just don't quite understand what he means by norms of rationality. I just feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, okay. Great question. I was hoping somebody would ask this. Meralda, what do you think is meant by a norm of rationality? Try it. Try coming up with an answer.
I don't know, I guess. Like when you're talking about like people believe this is how the world works, I assume that this is some way of evaluating like what it is we're supposed to do or how we're supposed to do it. And I have no idea if it's connected to utility or anything like that. Like I feel like I'm lost on that concept in general.
So let's go back. So some of you won't know this. Let me try to fill this in as best I can. For those of you who took Michael's class last fall, I believe he started with rationality, right?
Yep.
What did he say about rationality? What forms has it taken over time? Well, so I'm going on my conversations with Michael, so I may be off here a bit. So correct me if I'm wrong. The first, yeah, go ahead.
You mean like Herbert Simon and bounded rationality, like how we can know what we know and how we make decisions?
So I think we can get to bounded rationality after we first think about what rationality might be. Okay. So I think Michael started with an idea that the first idea about rationality was logic. Okay. That if you could show logically that X implied Y, that was a rational argument. Okay, so rationality was really limited to those things that you could kind of prove analytically, literally as mathematicians or analytical philosophers would do. So if, then, else, making sure that those things follow from each other. And then I think the point that Michael was making is that rationality has shifted a bit, and then it moved into a sense of optimizing, which is not necessarily a logical argument, but rather asking, of these two decisions, which one would give me the best outcome? Now, that, of course, requires you to establish an objective, okay, that's very well defined. And when you went down that path, you went down a path that said, okay, if we're really going to think about rationality as optimizing, then we actually have to think about all the things that we could choose. So if there's 5 things, we have to think about all 5 things that we could do. And we have to think about the trade-offs that would exist in each of those 5 things. We can't just consider 2, because what if they weren't as good as the third thing that we didn't consider? That wouldn't be rational. So we actually have to, so you can see then rationality requires a huge amount of information, because you need to know all of the outcomes that would occur, and you need to have an idea of how you would evaluate each of those many outcomes. So rationality then requires all of that. But I think that idea of rationality, just as rationality as maximization, is probably where we're sitting today in terms of understanding rationality. Now, I think you can bring Simon in, and Simon says, hold it, this doesn't make any, this simply is not possible. If you really want to be rational, you're going to have to do all the things that I've just said. You're going to have to understand all the options. You have to understand how each of those options would be evaluated. And you have to do that in the abstract. You can't put yourself in the situation and say, I don't like this situation. You have to be able to do it before you get there, so in the abstract. And Simon says, this isn't possible. We can't do this. We're humans. We're not these all-seeing machines that can do this. We can't possibly have a view of rationality. And so this is where he comes up with his bounded rationality. And he talks about having something that satisfies us. That we say we don't need the best, we just need one that's, we have some kind of standard, and we say, if we can get better than that and we find it, good, we're going to do that. And we don't, so then therefore we don't evaluate all the possibilities. And Lindblom comes along and says, the only way we can actually evaluate situations is to be in them, and we're determining both the trade-offs and the values that we assign to these things as we go along. Okay, so this is his muddling through argument. But of course, as you know, for those of you who took that class, Lindblom's arguments and Simon's arguments kind of get pushed aside in the academic literature, and the world goes on believing that we've got this kind of rational world. And people start to believe that what they're doing is rational. I think that this is the important thing, is that people had this kind of idea of that what they should be doing is more or less choosing on the basis of some kind of optimization, that they choose the two marketing strategies, which one gives me the biggest profit, which vacation is going to make me the happiest, going to place X or going to place Y, and all of a sudden all of our discussion is focused in that area, with that kind of a mindset. Okay, and I would need to work this out, but what Scott's saying is that norm of, I'm going to argue, maximization leads to organizations. And I think that the argument is actually quite simple there, at least on the surface, and that is that if you're optimizing something, for the most part, and if you, and this goes back to our beginning distinction between size of the pie and the distribution. Optimizing talks about the size of the pie. It's a real focus on the size of the pie. And so we now start to think about how can we make this pie bigger? And organizations have to be particularly good at that, because you can spread costs out across larger numbers of people. You get the kind of scale economies that occur because you can buy a bigger machine. You also get this specialization of labor that people like Adam Smith were talking about, and Ford picks up with the Model T, where you can actually think of an assembly line to create cars. So they can be, this is all of what Ford was aiming for. He wanted to build cars that would be cheap enough so that the people that he was employing on the assembly line could buy them. That was his circle. Okay? If he could build the car cheap enough so that his own people could buy them, he had created both the supply and the demand for the car at the same time. Okay? But he needed organization to be able to do that. You needed to have an assembly line. You needed to have people organized in a particular way. The only way you can do that is through an organization. Okay? So that would be my argument. That would be my attempt at an argument to come up with that. Comments? Questions? Now, I could be completely wrong. So.
Is the focus in that argument then the rationale of optimization, or is it just the fact that depending on the norm at the time of rationale, it creates different organizations?
One might wonder if you had stuck with the norm of just it being logical, what it would have given. I think I think we moved fairly quickly to the idea of rational being some kind of optimization. I think that happened fairly quickly, but one would have to think about that. And Scott would say that those things should have given rise to different types of features. I just don't have enough knowledge to be able to do that. But that would be the logical conclusion of what Scott's saying. Okay. Why don't we take... If we're done with Scott, it's now time to move on to Mo. We could be doing Mo for a little while here, so why don't we take a break, come back in 15 minutes. So everybody here and in Regina, mute your mic so that we don't give the other end of the line.
Are we muted now, Marie?
No, you're not. I can hear you.
Hi, Marie. Can you hear
Hi.
me? Can't. I put audio mute. That's what he asked. I don't know but I don't know if that's the right one. Remember, there's two.
Yes, I know.
Jean-Marc always does it.
Yeah. Where are you, Jean-Marc? Where are you? That's it. Jean-Marc, where are you muted?
You guys are not muted.
Yeah. Audio conference private. Yeah, he's at SUBA. They're doing Barefoot today.
What is that?
The Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association.
Oh,
So it's like all the cities and towns.
You guys are still, we can still hear you for what it's worth.
100 people.
1,000. Did you say 1,000?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Every.
I think they muted us instead of.
Coffee place. Huh? There's a coffee place there. You know?
Oh, I'm okay.
I will have one.
Yeah, you can have my coffee.
It's sitting there.
I want
You
coffee.
already have your coffee.
we don't. I have to go find that. I had no idea that I saw her on my phone since the first time. Yeah, come on. She just was. And then he just. Good. Yes. Well, because anything that's processed with government, it's not part of that. Well, except it's the community. It's in our care, and I have to make sure that it's properly cared for, and I only do that through you.
You're ready for this. You're ready for stress release.
Thank you.
Very well. Nice one.
It smells beautiful. I'll just keep it up on my face.
Ooh, can I have some?
Of course.
Is it for sleeping?
It's our stress release. That's good.
Nothing.
Oh my gosh. Todos los things. ¿Qué pasó al final? Contigo, tu proyecto. No, esta semana, estos días.
Mañana voy a la comunidad de un tipo de ¿cómo se dice? Ensayo. Research.
Investigación.
Entonces vamos a ver lo que pasa, no sé. Muchas gracias por tus consejos. Ay, aprendí mucho.
Nada.
Y tengo que empezar así, es que tenemos que hacer esas cosas, pero también podemos hacer esas otras cosas y no importa. No importa.
Al final no importa. Lo que importa es cómo reportas.
Exactly. Y voy a hacer eso a Anne. Yo sé que ella también tiene como
O cuando quieras conversar.
Ay,
Yo sé además que cuando uno está así, uno quiere solo compartir. Entonces, con mucho gusto. También gracias a ti por compartir. ¿Ya viste la tarea del texto? Te juro que no creo que entendí bien. Es que no tengo nada.
No me puedo forzar.
Pero bueno.
Pero los ejemplos pueden ser de cualquier parte, porque
entonces
tú tienes muchas que...
Sí. Sobre todo porque se rompen mucho las leyes. Maravilloso. Pero es como que quiero entender bien qué es una institución. ¿Me explico? O sea, no es lo mismo. A ver, el rule of law puede ser un principio y puede ser una institución a la vez. Entonces, por ejemplo, el uso legítimo de la fuerza. Sí. Entonces, claro, porque él te pone 4 cosas en esta lectura de Pearson. Hay 4 cosas que no tengo ni idea de cómo, o sea, porque me imagino que es una de esas, ¿no? No las 4.
Mira, yo tengo acá.
Large setup or fixed costs, learning effects, organization effects. Entonces, ¿qué significa? Que si es que yo, por ejemplo, tengo un ejemplo del uso de la fuerza, por ejemplo, hay un caso ahora de eso, del excesivo uso de la fuerza por parte de los policías. Ese puede ser mi ejemplo. ¿Cuál de los 4 es?
Ay, es que tengo que mirar en la página. Es página 224. A ver.
Jade, you did this Pearson reading, right? So you have all the information about it?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the assignment and how, for me, I'm struggling a lot about how to put examples that he's asking for in these 4 stages or factors or.
Okay, so this thing too is that this is all focused on technology, like his examples in that section are all on technology. So that's difficult to translate to, like we're talking about police brutality, like because that is something that you could use for this example, but yeah. So
I haven't looked at the actual assignment. Did he want us to focus on police brutality, or do
No,
we choose our own?
You choose your own example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you choose your own.
But all the examples that I can think about are related to norms or, that's what I do. But I can really because the first struggle that I have is how to define an institution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that one.
I think this conversation helped a lot.
Yeah. Sorry?
That today helped me a lot understand the whole institutions, because I did institutions versus culture versus organization. To me, culture and institution,
they're so similar. They have so many overlaps. So it's hard to pull out which one.
Organizations run through institutions, right through the institutional framework. So organizations kind of develop because of institutions and the rational logic of the institution that you run the organization.
So if you think about the UN, for example, right? So that would be like an international organization that works to become true or something like that, the institutions that are behind, right? But then for me, the struggle that I have is how do you know what's an institution and what's a principle? Like international law, you have a lot of principles. Right?
Principles all fit within an institution. So there'll be multiple principles within an institution.
Yeah, I think it's just one step.
Right, so I don't think one thing is necessarily the institution in and of itself, like one individual thing. It has to be kind of a framework. Almost.
Yeah, so for example, these principles that we have in international law, that you have to respect the other states and you cannot invade them. I don't know how to say it in English. Yeah? So that would be like an institution or a principle?
That would be, I think it's both. The
would be a fantasy.
a principle, but broadly as an institution.
And then if we want to use that example for the assignment, how do they fit in these 4 features? Because he says that we have to use those 4 features.
All right. Regina, can you hear us? Regina, can you hear us?
Not if you guys.
All right. Good. Terry Moe. We're going to spend a little bit more time on Moe because there's a couple of things I want to show you a bit more kind of formally how Moe is doing things. But first of all, we're going to hear from Bianca. So.
In general, what he's talking about is the rational theory.
So generally, Mo's talking about the rational choice theory of political institutions, and generally in that literature, they focus on cooperation, but they don't focus on power as an equally important theoretical component. So, I mean, really, in short, his argument is that they should include power better into the theoretical argument. So, so it should reflect that those with power actually do end up determining the institutions, so that their interests are represented in those institutions. And institutions determine threat points. So threat points, which aren't mentioned in the article, are the guaranteed payoff for an actor who doesn't cooperate in a bargain. So basically, so again, institutions determine threat points, and then from there, those threat points determine the conditions of cooperation, as well as who benefits from cooperation and how much. Is there anything else I should talk about, or?
It's yours. You got the floor.
I had some problems with the application of threat points, which I talked to Murray about, so maybe I understand it now and maybe I don't. But so for those who don't want to participate in the bargain and they have the ability to stop the bargain from occurring, their threat point, or what their guaranteed payoff is when they don't want to cooperate, is the status quo. But that's only if they have the power to actually stop the bargain from happening. But if you don't want to participate in the bargain and you don't have the power to stop the deal, so it's just going to be implemented anyways, your threat point or your guaranteed payoff is just what the result of the bargain is. You can't change it. Yeah, and part of how Mo talks about the effect that institutions have is that basically is like a little story. So there's a man, just walking around, and a second man with a knife comes up to him and is like, okay, well, I can take your money or I can take your life. So you can so the man can, in a sense, voluntarily say, okay, you can take my wallet or you can murder me. But it doesn't matter if you want to view it as voluntary or if you want to view it as coercive. Either way, the rules of the game has changed. And this is a very small way to explain how institutions are, but when you have someone who's in power, they can impose institutions that change the rules of the game.
Yeah, so we're going to pick up on that. I want to actually show you that little example, because in many ways, there's a lot of material in this Mo article. Some of it, a good portion of it, can be captured actually in that little vignette that he uses about somebody being held up, either by knife point or gun point on the street. Before we get to that, though, but let me just go back to the beginning of this, because there's another element here that I do want to discuss. Bianca's right. Mo starts off by saying what's happened in the academic literature, particularly in economics, is that there's been a focus on the gains from cooperation rather than power. And I want to show you what that means in something that's actually quite familiar to you. Mo describes this, but I just want to make sure that you see the connection. So let's go back to the very beginning of this paper. What's the couple of first examples that he uses where he talks about the benefit of cooperation, how institutions could achieve something that would be better for both parties? And what does this make you think of? What's the connection of this to stuff that we've done in class?
The cooperation game?
Yeah, this is the cooperation game. So let me just do this again. So we've got two players, X and Y. They each have two strategies, A and B. Okay, so X is along the top, going from left to right. Y, so A is the first strategy, B is the second strategy. Y down the vertical axis, first strategy is A, second strategy below that is B. And then if it ends up that X is playing A and Y is playing A, let's say that payoff is 10-10. Okay. If Y is playing A and X is playing B, then let's say that the payoff is 12-7. If in sort of the inverse of that, if X is playing A and Y is playing B, then the payoff is 7 for A and 12 for B. And finally, if sorry? If X is playing A and Y is playing B, then the payoffs are 7 and 12 for X and Y respectively. Is that okay? Okay. Whoops. Shoot. I've lost there's something wrong with my internet connection today, and I keep losing it. So now I've got to go back, recreate. Now I've got a different color pen. Holy smokes. Okay, so 2 players, X and Y, 2 strategies, A and B. Payoffs, if they both play A, payoffs are 10 and 10. Let's go, I'm going to change this 12 and 6. 6 and 12 are the diagonals. So if X is playing B and Y is playing A, X gets 12, B gets 6. Inversely, if X is playing A and Y is playing B, X gets 6 and B gets 12. And then finally, let's say that this final payoff is 7 and 7. So if they both play B, they both get 7. Now this is a standard prisoner's dilemma. Okay, both X and Y have a dominant strategy, which is to always play B. So regardless of what the other player is doing, okay, each of the players that we could consider would say, "Gee, the best thing for me to do is to play B." Sorry, because think of player X. If Y is playing A, player X should play B rather than A because 12 is bigger than 10. If 12 is bigger than 10. If Y is playing B, then X should play B rather than A, because if they play B, they get 7. If they play A, they get 6. So they should always play B. And the same argument applies in the opposite for the other. We looked at the game the other way. So this 7-7 is the prisoners. It's a Nash equilibrium. It's where we would expect this sort of group of people to end up if they were just each acting on their own best interests. That's where we would expect them to end up. And yet that's an inferior outcome. So we could ask, how could we get a better outcome? How could we get a non-Nash equilibrium like 10-10? Okay, 7-7 is, or BB is the Nash equilibrium. How could we get the non-Nash equilibrium that's better for both players? Well, one answer, okay, is create an institution that says, okay, playing A is a good thing to do. Imagine that there was a norm that one should first of all play A. Okay, what if that was the norm in society? Okay, then both parties would start off playing A, and they'd say, gee, this is good, I get 10. I have no desire to change this norm. This is a great norm. Okay, and you could imagine that norm continuing, and you would have this behavior extended and reproduced over time. Okay? And we'll come back and talk about that process in just a little bit. So when Mo at the beginning of his paper talks about how and why economists have focused on cooperation as the main impact, or institutions as giving rise to cooperation, this is exactly what he's talking about. Okay? Similar type games to this one, where in the absence of a norm, of an institution that would encourage cooperation, people will free ride, they will act opportunistically, and they will end up in a worse position than they would if they could follow some kind of a norm. And so when this is in part what North and others are saying, if you have a good norm within society, as opposed to a kind of an unhealthy norm, you could get to a much better outcome for your group. And there's no question, and I don't think Mo is arguing that this is not the case, there's no question that some of those norms do emerge and that they're actually quite important. Okay? If we go back to the Ostrom piece that we read, where Ostrom talks about those design principles that are put in place, so you have a group of people that define the boundaries of their resource, they define the rules that they're going to use, they define who's going to monitor them, they define what the penalties are. What they've devised is an set of institutions that could actually encourage then this cooperative behavior. And anybody that deviates this gets punished, but in fact, there's people willing to do the punishment, and it all works, and lo and behold, these people get out of their common pool problem. Okay? So Ostrom's piece is a really good example of taking us from this outcome, the 7-7, the Nash equilibrium, and actually moving off the Nash equilibrium back to an outcome that's much better. Okay? Mo's point is not that that doesn't happen. It does. It's that that doesn't seem to say anything about power. Okay? And he says, if we think about power in institutions, we're not going to find it here. Okay? This may be a good line of argument to go down, and in fact, don't get me wrong, I think this is actually really critical. Okay? But don't for a moment think that this has anything to do with power. Okay? We need to think about how we would introduce power into this. Okay? So then when he goes and talks about the principal agent problem, he's talking about something that I won't go into the details, but it looks something like this, same structure. Two players, they can both be made better off if they could just figure out that arrangement that allows them to contract with each other in a way. They could both be better off. If they can't find that way, then they're worse off. Okay. Any questions? So this is where Mo starts, and it's actually really good for us because it gives us a way of moving into the stuff that I want to talk about. Okay. Everybody with me at this stage? Okay. Now, one of the things about Nash, this is John Nash, the mathematician, economist, is that he saw and he developed, when he developed his theory of that eventually became known as the Nash equilibrium, he actually understood that the Nash equilibrium would be the basis of bargaining for a better outcome. Okay? And so for him, the Nash equilibrium was the worst that you could do. You could do better than that if you could just figure out a way to cooperate. Okay? And so for him, the 7-7, and this language actually goes back to at least him, and he picks this up. The 7-7, the payoffs that A and B get are referred to as just came up. There we go. The Nash equilibrium are the threat points. Now, this is an important idea from game theory. Okay, what are threat points? And they actually are really closely linked to a Nash equilibrium. So a threat point is, okay, what could I credibly threaten? If I'm engaged in a bargain with another player, what could I credibly threaten? What could I credibly threaten and say, if we don't enter into a bargain, then I'm going to do this? Okay, what could I credibly threaten? That's what a threat point is. It has to be, this is really critical, threat points have to be credible. And what do we mean by credible? The other party has to believe you. Okay? Now, credibility can be established in a number of different ways. Okay? One of them is if you're completely crazy, okay, and you threaten to do something that seems to be completely bizarre, not in your best interest, but you're known to be a crazy person, and you just do things that you say you're going to do every once in a while or on a regular basis, then saying something that's just crazy could be a credible threat. Okay? When Donald Trump says he's going to do X, even though it might not be in the best interests of whoever, you actually have to take him seriously because he's been known to do that kind of thing in the past. Okay? So it's his craziness that actually provides the credibility. Okay? Otherwise, you have to do something that the other party could say, yeah, actually, I could believe that you would do that. Okay? In other words, and the best example, the best candidate for that is what is in your best interests to do. That is the best candidate for a credible threat. What would you do? What would you sort of find in your best interest to do? Okay. So let me give you an example. And this is going to take us into bargaining. You're going to see why we need to do this. Think about how many of you have bought a car. Okay. So this is actually good. Some of you have, some of you haven't. So those of you who haven't, you can imagine this, and then you can talk to the people, okay, that have bought cars. Okay. Now imagine that you are. Here's the situation. You're looking for. I'm going to think of two people. I want you to compare two people. They're both looking for the same type of car, small car, maybe sort of a mid-sized car. It might even be, let's say it's used. They want something. They don't need a used car. Low mileage because they might want to drive it for a while. So roughly the same sort of car. Imagine now two people going into the sales room. The first person is a person who already has a vehicle at home and they're looking for a second car to, when somebody else in their family is off driving, they have another car that they can use to do things. Okay, that's the one person. The other person, it's their first car. And so that's some of you. Imagine doing this in your first car, and you have a job, and that person has a job on the far side of the city, and the public transit's terrible, and they need a car to get there. Okay? Two people looking for exactly the same sort of car, but two very different profiles. Tell me, which of those people is going to get a better deal, do you think, after they walk out with a car? Who's going to pay the lower price? No, suppose they have the same type of bargaining power. The only thing that's different is the situation that I've described. Yeah, in terms of...
Oh, like they're mad the way they look.
Yeah.
So then the person who has a car at home is going to get the better price because they have the credible threat of walking away.
I can't hear
Okay.
you. Woke her up. I can't hear you.
Is that right or no?
You got to hit the button.
The person with the car at home would have the credible threat of walking away, so they would have the lower price negotiated.
Okay.
They don't need the car as much.
How many people would vote that way? How many people would vote for the person that's just getting their first car, needs it really badly, that they would get the lower price? Okay. Well, standard bargaining theory says that the person who already has a car will get the better deal for exactly the reason that Gillian outlined. Okay? Because they could credibly say to the salesperson, no, I don't like your idea. I'm walking away. I don't need to take that price that you're offering. I'm out of here. And if they had communicated to the salesperson that this is who they were, they could actually credibly say that. Okay, and the other person, the salesperson would have to believe them. Okay, say, yeah, actually, I believe that you will because you don't need a car right now. Whereas the other person, they say, I'm out of here. You don't really believe that that's what they're going to do. Now, unless they're crazy, okay, and they walk out, and then they're stuck taking a taxi for the next 3 days until they try this again on another dealership, right? But the point is, the person with the better threat point gets the better deal. Okay? And the threat point is, what can you credibly commit to? Okay? The great thing about Nash equilibria, and Nash understood this right away, the Nash equilibria are credible threats. And you can see this because it's the dominant strategy. It's the thing that you would do regardless. And so it has to be the credible threat, right, to both parties. And then both parties could say, yeah, but we could do better than that. But everyone could say, if you don't agree to that, to the bargain, I'm going to play my Nash equilibrium strategy. And the other guy say, yep, I understand. That's exactly what you would do. Okay? So the point of this is that here we have a cooperation game. Okay, we use institutions to get out of the situation that we would find ourselves in if we played the Nash equilibrium. But the Nash equilibrium isn't unimportant in this story because it actually anchors the starting point for the bargain. And it does so because the way it anchors it is because it serves as the threat point. Okay? Now, you might say, okay, so why is this important?
So I guess I'm thinking of like a reservation price, but
yep.
When I'm bargaining,
you'll have to. We have to teach you to always turn on your mic.
When I'm thinking of coordinating and trying to get to point AA, the threat point is 7-7, but what I have to negotiate with is 3. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep, that's right.
So I credibly know I'm credibly willing to give up 3 because that's my next best. Is that the way to think of it as well?
No.
I think I might be thinking about it wrong.
No, not quite. If the bargain doesn't work, so imagine this. Here you've got so both A and B have on the Nash equilibrium have a payoff of 7. Okay, so you could say, if I don't get at least 7, I'm walking. Okay? I'm going back and I'm just going to play my Nash equilibrium. And the other person says, yeah, okay, I got you. So the other player, if you're bargaining and the other player offers you 6, you could say, no, forget that. I'm out of here. I'm going to play my Nash equilibrium. Likewise, you can't offer to the other player anything more, anything less than 7, because they'll say, nope, forget it. I can leave. I can go and just play my Nash equilibrium.
So in the example then you just discussed being in different threat points with the person with 2 cars at home and 1 car at home, forgetting that it probably wouldn't make sense as far as choice goes, but the Nash would maybe be 8 and 7 because they come from 2 different threat points?
Don't think about that as a Nash equilibrium. Okay?
Okay.
What I'm trying to do, the reason of introducing the car example, the car sale, is to give you an idea of what a threat, what a credible threat is. Okay? And only that. I don't mean to say that you're bargaining with over a car resembles a prisoner's dilemma. It may or it may not. My only point for bringing it in is to help you and others understand what I mean by a threat point and what it means to be credible. Okay? That's the element. Okay, so why is this important? So Mo's absolutely right to say this story that I've got sketched out here about finding an institutional way, using institutions to get to that 10-10 is correct. Okay, it doesn't involve power. Okay, it's a cooperation story, not a power story. But so where does power show up? Well, for Mo, it is sort of taking a step back and understanding that there's another layer to this game. Okay, and that so here's where the example of this person on the street who gets accosted by this person wielding a gun or a knife. Okay, so now you need to think about 2 different scenarios. Okay, the one scenario, there is no person with the gun, and this person's walking along the street, and their sort of next best alternative. But by the way, the 7-7, the threat point, is also another way to think about this is the next best alternative. Okay, what if I don't have the bargain? What's my next best alternative? Okay, so if you're this person walking along on the street and there is no mugger out that night, okay, then you don't have to worry about your next best alternative is exactly the situation that you're in. No, that is how do I say this? You're now in a world where you're safe. Your life is, short of a lightning bolt coming down and getting you. You think you're safe. And if somebody was to come up and say, give me your wallet, and you'd say, if they don't have a gun, and they're not really big, you'd say, you might be a bit worried, but you'd say, no, forget that. You're just being silly. Go home. Run away. Okay? That's the one world. The other world is you're walking along, somebody comes up and says, give me your wallet, and they have a knife. What they've done is they've changed your next best alternative in that situation. Okay? Because in the first case, where safe street, all of that stuff, the other person doesn't have a gun, they say, give me your money, and you say, no. Okay? Your next best alternative is, sort of to ignore them. Okay? That is actually a credible threat, to ignore them and say, go home. Okay? In this world, however, your next best, your credible threat, your credible action, your next best alternative isn't to say, oh, go home. Okay? Because if you think that they're serious about using that knife or that gun, then the consequences will be you're dead. And so your next best alternative just took a dramatic fall. Okay? It went from here to here. Okay? Or if you want to, you've just become in the bargaining over the price of the car, you've become the guy that has to drive across town for the job, rather than the person who's looking for a second car. Okay? So it matters which of these two situations you're in. Okay? The next best alternative is very, very different in the situation where the streets are safe versus the case where the mugger has some kind of a weapon. Okay? And what Mo is saying is that it's in this stage of what is the scenario that's being played out, that's where power becomes important. And power becomes important for determining which state you are in. Are you in this state where your next best alternative is pretty good, or are you in this state where your next best alternative is not so good? Because your outcome is going to depend upon your next best alternative. And in fact, what power does is it sets up institutions, and the institutions define these states. So this state is defined by one set of institutions. This state is defined by a different set of institutions. And so the way that power gets wielded is by establishing the institutions that sets up the next best alternatives for the people that are in that particular set of institutions. Now, those institutions that are set up are going to be, they're going to benefit different people. Okay?
Are you using state and scenario interchangeably in that example? So it sets up, institutions set up the state, you said? Do you mean in the previous example, set up the scenario? Or is that?
I do want you to think about, these are, so when I said state, I don't mean sort of a government necessarily. I'm thinking, let me stick with scenario. So this institution sets up one way that things are likely to play out. This set of institutions would set up the way that things would play out in a different way. This situation gives, if you like, power to people with just to use this example that Mo uses, gives the advantage to people with guns and knives, and takes the advantage away from people that don't have those things. Okay? In this one, it gives advantage to those people who are just walking down the street peacefully. Okay? Just to be kind of really simplistic about this. On the other,
can you put this in a governance of system like dictatorship and democracy like that?
No. Because that's not necessarily these two things. Because one can think about a democracy that would vote in one set of rules that would create this kind of a situation, okay, and another set of rules that would create this sort of situation. So these aren't situations where one's democracy and one's non-democratic state. This is possible within any system of government. Because now I want to take you back to Coase. Okay? You say, oh God, Coase. What did Coase tell us?
COAST was based around the idea that the optimal outcome could be achieved through bargaining and cooperation.
Yes, but there is more than that. So yes, but keep going.
Not really certain where to take it from there.
Okay. Let me give you. Let me go back. So this is COAST. We had. I won't go through all of the. I'll just summarize. If the doctor had the property rights, this should summarize what we did before. The benefit to the doctor was going to be 120, and the benefit to I called him the baker, the confectioner, was going to be 80. If the baker had the property rights, then we had the doctor having anywhere between 80 to 100 benefit, depending upon how well they were able to bargain. And the baker had anywhere from 80 to 120. Okay. And it depended upon how much they could get when they actually sat down across the bargaining table. But notice that if the doctor had the property rights, the doctor got 120. The most that the doctor could get, if the baker had the property rights, it was 100. So the doctor always would prefer the situation where she had the property rights. Okay, and the baker, if the baker had the property rights, he would get at least 80. He could get up to 120, which would always be at least as good and probably better than what he could get if the doctor had the property rights. So here, the allocation of the property rights determined the distribution of the pie. Okay, in that zero transaction cost, it didn't say it changed the size of the pie, just changed the distribution. But it does change the distribution. Okay, so now imagine. Okay, we have exactly the situation that I just described. Okay, a moment ago, but now we're going to take account of this first part of determining the property rights. So imagine now that the property rights get settled with the doctor. Okay, well, because they have the property rights, that actually set up their threat points, and these bargains, those payoffs, emerge from the threat points that was established because the property rights were allocated in a particular way. And if the baker had the property rights, these payoffs are determined because the property rights were given to the baker, which established the next best alternative. Okay? Because the property rights in this case said, what can I do? So if the baker had the property rights, the baker could say, doctor, forget it. You can't build your sorry, the other way around. The baker could say, I have the property rights. I can put my machine wherever I want it to put it. Whatever happens to you, tough. I have the ability to be able to do that. The doctor has, the only credible threat that the doctor could have is to say, okay, then I'm going to take away my patients. And I'm not going to have that many patients, and I'm not going to be earning that extra revenue. Okay, so then that actually sets up the position for a bargain where the baker says, "Oh, okay, well, you know what? Since you're going to be getting all that extra money from having those extra patients, why don't you give me that? I will then voluntarily shut down my machine if you make me the payment, so you can get the benefit." Okay, but notice. It was because the baker had the property right that it changed the threat point of the doctor, which allowed the bargain then to take place. Okay? And so what Mo is talking about is actually this determination of the property rights, of the determination of those sets of rules that then subsequently set up the default values, the threat points, that then you might get cooperation occurring. Okay? So now there's a dual role for institutions. The institutions are creating these default values here or here, but then institutions are also, once these institutions are set up, they're setting up mechanisms to get to the cooperative bargain from prisoner's dilemma situations. Okay? So you have to think of institutions playing two different roles. And when you think about the first one, that one is largely about power. Okay? And the second one is largely about the cooperation. Okay? And that's what Mo is saying in much of that second part of the article. Okay? Does that make sense? No. Okay, so tell me what you're missing, because this is my job to get you to the point where this makes sense.
With the introduction of power, what I gather from what you just said is it sort of revises the status quo. Is that it?
It does change the status quo, and the status quo is in most cases what the default values are. Okay? They at least are closely tied to the default values that the various parties can expect. Who else? Maria, you had a question. Because I noticed you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time to process, I guess. So if there is no transaction cost, like you said with the cost theory, like with the cost...
So the example I had no transaction costs.
Okay.
If you have transaction costs, the story I just went through is actually even simpler, because there is no benefit, there is no way to be able to come to a cooperative agreement. The property rights define the allocation of the benefits. So now there's no role for institutions to create cooperation, because cooperation is impossible because the transaction costs are too high. All the action is in the determination of which regime are we in. This property rights or this property rights. So institutions then are all about power. All about power. So in a coast world with transaction costs, the role of power becomes even more important. Not less important, more important.
So just to clarify that then, so the state is playing this dual role in the Coasian world without transaction costs, but you're saying that in the real world with transaction costs it's solely based on power, then, and then how does the dual role model translate to the real world, I guess?
I would say, we have transaction costs. They're not always so large as to preclude cooperation. Okay? So this is what you have to remember. You can have non-zero, you can have transaction costs that are positive, but they don't eat up all of the gains from cooperation, and so people still have an incentive to cooperate. Okay? Particularly if one of the things that institutions may do is they may, in fact, there's a lot of people that write about this, they may lower transaction costs. Okay? So without institutions, you could think about all the back and forth that would have to happen to get an agreement. if there was an institution that this is how these types of arrangements are made, then you can reach an agreement very quickly and you don't have to incur those costs. And all of a sudden now things that you couldn't have negotiated before could be negotiated. Okay.
Isn't a large part, if you think of a firm,
Yeah, you're okay.
if you think of a firm as an institution, isn't a large part of creation of a firm to minimize transaction costs?
So first of all, you can't think of a firm as an institution. You can think of institutions inside the firm.
Okay.
Okay. And there we tend to talk about them as being culture and maybe institutional logics that have existed within the firm. So organizations and firms can have their own kind of internal institutions and rules, but they're not institutions.
Yep.
Small point, but. Yeah. So let me give you an example of the latter. Let's take land rentals in, say, rural Saskatchewan, but this would also apply in any place in the world. When I was growing up, the standard rental agreement was and almost everybody had a crop share, 2/3, 1/3. And there was sort of a norm that was the way that it was divided, okay, 2/3, 1/3. And that actually that lasted for a very long time. That's no longer the norm these days, by the way. But that was for a very long time. And if you think about that, once that norm was in place, you have a landlord and a farmer that wanted to rent some land, they would sit down to say, and as long as there was this dominant kind of institution in the background, 1/3, 2/3, they would both say, gee, is this could you live with that? And one guy would say, yeah, that probably works for me. The other guy would say, yeah, that works for me. And they could quickly come to an agreement, and the transaction cost would be actually very, very low. Okay. Whereas imagine that there was no norm, and instead those two players had to come together and they had to say, gee, what should we do? I want to rent your land. The other guy says, yeah, I'd like to do that. But now he said, gee, we have to find out, one guy says, I need to know exactly what your costs are. And the other guy says, well, I need to know what mine are. And you don't trust the other guy if he's giving you correct ones. And so you hire a third party to come in and do soil tests. And you see how it adds up to trying to just figure out what this rental rate should be. Okay. And at some point, the two parties may say, yeah, forget it. This is going to take too much work. The benefits of engaging in this transaction don't allow us to cover all those costs. We're not going to do that. So if we can have an institution that would substitute for some of that fact gathering and so forth, bingo, all of a sudden things that we couldn't have done become possible. Okay, so that's another role that institutions have, is lowering transaction costs as well as creating the norms to go to cooperative solutions in prisoner's dilemma type games.
Most of the things we have discussed so far is after somebody gets the property rights, and how does that exchange the power play?
Right.
But my question is, what power has to say before somebody gets the property rights? So let's say whether the bakery is getting it or the doctor is getting it.
Right.
So at the end of the day, can you say that the person or the group with more power will eventually get the property rights? Can you say that, or that's not always the case?
Yeah. So you can think about. Let me see if I can. Seems to come up with random colors. Let me do it this way. You can think about this a little bit like stages. So we have a stage 1, and then a stage 2. And let's just think of two players here, okay, X and Y, just to keep it simple, but in the real world, of course, it's much more complex than that. And in stage one, you can think of there being a potential for two different regimes, okay? Regime 1, capital Roman numeral 1, and regime 2, Roman numeral 2, okay? And in regime 1, you have the two players, X and Y, and the property rights are let's see, how do I want to express this? We're going to have one set of property rights. So we're going to have the property rights for X in regime 1 and the property rights for Y in regime 1. Okay? And those property rights are going to determine threat points, which will determine some final allocation of benefits, a benefit to X in regime 1 and a benefit B to Y in regime 1. Okay? So regime 1 sets up it establishes property rights in a particular fashion between X and Y. And let's say in this case, X gets the property rights, Y doesn't. Okay? Those establish the threat points, which then form the basis for some kind of further action, some kind of cooperative action perhaps, that determines a set of benefits to each of those two parties. But in regime 2, there's something similar going on, except it's a different allocation of property rights. Here's property, it's an allocation like this, okay? So there's a property right allocation P, the allocation of property rights to X in regime 2, allocation of property rights to Y in regime 2. They give rise to a set of threat points, which give rise to a different set of benefits, BX in regime 2, and the benefits to Y in regime 2. Okay? Now, what Mo is saying is that the action around power is a fight, let's put it this way, a contest between X and Y as to who gets to establish the institutions or the property rights, who wins out in that battle. Do we end up with regime 1 or do we end up in regime 2? Okay. Now we don't know, right? It's going to depend upon how good X and Y and what kind of de facto power they have and what kind of de jure power they have. Okay. And so we're going to have de facto and de jure power of X and Y influencing that battle, if you like, for which regime we're going to be in, which set of property rights we're going to have.
This is the only factor which will determine who gets the property rights, because the size of the pie, as you said, if we say that there's no transaction cost, stays the same. So then the only other consideration is which group has more power, whether that's effective or deterrent, right?
So I'm simplifying it. There's a whole bunch of other things going on in this. Just to keep it really simple, what I'm doing is keeping the power at this stage in this allocation of property rights, okay, in the stage 1. Okay? Stage 2, once the threat points have been established, these sets of threat points are very different than the threat points down here. Okay? It's like in this case, in this case you're X and you have a job across town. In this case, you're X and you have a need for a second car. Okay? You're going to end up in a very different outcome. You're going to get a different benefit depending upon which regime you ended up in. Okay? So that, except that now we're not allocating people across regimes, we're allocating the rules that govern those regimes. Okay? And what Mo is saying is that that's where we need to look for power. And I think he's right. Okay? That's that earlier game. Remember we talked about this in the very first day, that what Coase doesn't do is he doesn't have a dynamic idea of how property rights are determined. What we're now looking at are some theories about how those property rights could actually be determined. And those are going to be determined by other battles. Okay? Now, how do those property rights, but it isn't just property rights, it's property rights. I've called these property rights, but I could call them institutions. I could call them norms of behavior. Okay? I could call them rules that people are expected to follow. Okay? And we can see that these are, so now I want to just tie in the rest of the stuff from today's class. If these property rights / institutions / norms are based upon, at least some of them are based upon ideas that have been established by one group or another, and then have been internalized and people start to see the world this way, okay, then we can actually see that these might be particular ways that people have of viewing the world, of saying what's important. Okay? So this property right could be one group having one out saying these things are important. Whereas this set of property rights reflects a different group having one kind of the contest of ideas and having put forth a different idea. So this, for those of you doing the PhD course in ideas, which you will take with Danielle Balland, one of the, and we'll see actually reference to this, I think, but there's a paper by Hall. What's Hall's first name? Peter Hall. Peter Hall. This is his paradigm paper from the early 1980s, where he describes two different. He gives a number of examples, but he describes the regime, the kind of shift in paradigm thinking in economic models, where a tradition, the view of kind of the Keynesian model coming out of the Second World War, and really embodied in all of the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, that set of ideas being replaced by a monetarist view of the world. And those are two completely separate ways of understanding the world, two completely separate, different ideas. And they pay attention to different things in the economy. The monetary economics pays attention to really one factor, the size of the money supply. They say government doesn't have much other role besides controlling the size of the money supply. Marc-André knows way more about this than I do, so I'm going to get into all kinds of trouble. But that was a view that had supplanted Keynesian economics, which is saying, no, it's all about fiscal policy, about taxation, and so forth. Okay, and which of these actually can affect the real economy, which is really the size of the pie. And those two things fundamentally, when you shifted the ideas from a Keynesian view of the world to a monetarist view of the world, you went from regime 1 to regime 2. And a different group of people were now advantaged and disadvantaged under these two regimes. Okay. Just like, almost just like that. Now, this is a process that took about 10 years, but by the time that that process took place, you had completely changed people's threat points and what they could do.
Prof, please, just for clarification.
Is that on?
Yes.
Okay.
Just for clarification, I just want to know whether Mo is saying that in terms of power, no matter how individuals decide to coordinate to increase outcome, it is institution which establish power and determines what is acceptable. Is that what, like in conclusion or in summary?
So my question back to you is interpret that through this. Interpret what you just asked through this. Can you see what you just said in what I've outlined?
Yes, because when you started explaining the power concept, trying to say power gives the next alternative, using states where you say that taking consideration of two states, institution can determine maybe whether to give advantage to people with guns or people without guns. We further on move to different discussion with trying to establish these stretch points, but I realize that most of the time, how you're trying to explain is linked to maybe institutions come out or norms come up to tie it up and give power to what needs to be done. So I just want to clarify whether the way I'm thinking is how you're saying it or I'm thinking differently from what you're explaining.
Say that last part again.
Please, from the beginning of the lecture, you tried to explain how coordination is, like with the coordination games, and we used where we have the Nash equilibrium, which is 7-7, and individual want to move to 10-10.
Okay, so
increase the outcome.
Right. So first of all, those aren't coordination games. Those are prisoner's dilemma games.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to inquire whether if you are coordinating to increase outcome, if you are coordinating.
Okay, but actually, let me stop you there. That's not the right language. Okay, I started with cooperation to get the higher outcome, not coordinating to get the higher outcome.
Cooperation, yeah.
Okay.
Cooperation instead of coordinating.
Okay, so keep going.
It is institution which establish power. So does it mean institution rather establish the power and determines what needs to be done?
Say that again.
Is it institution that, because institution is kind of norm where you stated that, for example, if you are going to buy land, in terms of transaction costs, it reduces transaction costs and it makes it clear for individual to enter into contracts. So I just want to be clear whether it is institution which gives power and determines what should be done based on this scenario.
So what I want to say is that institutions are playing a role in multiple places in here. Okay, institutions are playing a role in the institutions that underpin regime 1 are different than the institutions that underpin regime 2. Or another way of putting it, these property rights, so if we just want to go back to Coase for a second, those property rights that Coase talks about really are institutions. They're an example of an institution. Okay, they're saying, let's go back to our baker and our confectioner, our confectioner and our doctor. They're either saying, doctor, you have the right to be able to run your office quietly, or confectioner, you have the right to be able to run your machine. Okay? We can either give the property right here or we can give it here. That is an institution. Okay? It's an example of an institution. Okay? So, property rights are institutions. Institutions aren't all property rights. There's institutions come in other forms as well. One type of institution would be a property right. Okay? So what you're seeing here between regime 1 and regime 2 is choosing between one set of institutions versus another set of institutions. Okay? And institutions then become important it's the institutions that determine these threat points. Okay? It's these norms of behavior, it's the property rights that determine the threat points. The threat points then serve as the basis for potential cooperation and maybe coordination as well. Okay? Now, it is true that there could be, in order to move from the threat points, which is the minimum that you could get, to these benefits that you finally get, it may require other institutions that help you achieve that kind of cooperation so that you don't end up back in the prisoner's dilemma, but that you move to a better outcome. Institutions play a role here as well. They will be different institutions, though they may be connected to the institutions that established the regime in the first place. Okay? But they are playing a separate role. Okay? So institutions are coming in two places, and they're playing different functions within this economic system.
So, please, does it mean that this same institution is going to determine which kind of regime are we going to move along with?
The institutions are characteristic. So we end up defining regimes by the set of institutions that they have. Okay, it's not that the regimes are somehow predetermined. It's that when we see a set of institutions that work together, we say, "Oh, that's regime 1." When we see a different set of institutions, we say, that's regime 2. Okay? We're going to see this, by the way. This is, again, the same Peter Hall, and he's got a paper with a fellow by the name of Soskich. We're going to see this later on. There's a whole literature around varieties of capitalism. And the idea around varieties of capitalism is that there are, in fact, within a capitalist economy, there are at least 2 ways, and people now say that there's actually many, many different ways of running a capitalist economy. Okay? And one way of doing it would be called, and it's been given a name, coordinated market economies, CMEs. Another way would be liberal market economies, LMEs. But we define the regime by the set of institutions that are at work. Okay? Not that the regime is something separate. It's just the name that we give to that particular constellation. And what I would say is that these regimes that emerge and remain stable because they work in some way, shape, or form. Okay? They're able to then persist enough. They're able to generate enough benefits to the people and so forth that they can be sustained over time. Okay? Because you can imagine some regimes, some constellation of institutions would be put together and then they all fall apart. The institutions don't match up with each other. They don't reinforce each other. And so the whole thing crumbles. Okay? But some of them end up reinforcing each other, and you get this situation where it marches on. Particularly if the institutions that define these end up also creating the kind of conditions to allow that cooperation to occur at that second stage.
Thanks so much, Prof. There's a last question. If I have these 2 regimes, what will cause one regime to be picked over the other? I just want to get the point of power.
Okay, what's going to cause one regime to be chosen over the other? Who has the power? It goes back to who has the de facto power and the de jure power. So you got to go back to that Asimoglu and Robinson paper and say, okay, these are the 2 types of power. And now we're getting an idea, right? The de jure power is the power that's built into legal rules and actual some norms that get established. And now we know from Pearson and so forth that once these get established, they're going to be very, very hard to break. Okay? Now, I want you to think about this. Two different regimes. You can imagine getting into this one versus getting into this one. It's the power that it's the power balance that determines this. What do we expect about this regime and this regime? We're going to expect that they're going to be relatively kind of coherent, right? They kind of work on each other. So now, let me see if I can find this little. Let me give you an example. Because I want to now build something else, show you something else. So I'm going to get rid of this diagram and do another one. Let's go back to a simple game. And now let's think about, let's do this. Let's label these 1 and 2. So now, X and Y could kind of be, we're going to talk about what they would like in terms of regimes. Okay? And under regime 1, here, suppose these are the payoffs. Okay? So under regime, if you're in regime 1, okay, X gets 10, Y gets 6. Okay? Let's say that this is under something where you have regime 1, Y wants regime 1, X wants regime 2. Okay, so you kind of some kind of a hybrid. Suppose you could put a hybrid together. Okay, let's suppose that that hybrid actually doesn't work very well, and you're down to X getting 2 benefit of 2, and Y only getting a benefit of 1. Okay, and now let's go with 1 and 2 under a combination of Y is in regime 2, X is in regime 1. And now let's have, they're both in regime 2, and that, the places are switched. And X only gets a payoff of 6, Y gets a payoff of 10. Okay? You're right. How come? No, there we are. I just have to refresh somehow. Okay. Now, does anybody know what? This is a game that we've seen before. What game is it? This is a coordination game. There's 2 Nash equilibria here. Okay? So the idea here is if Y is playing regime 1, X wants to be in regime 1 as well. Okay? Because 10 is better than 2 by a long shot. So X would say, gee, yeah, if Y's in regime 1, I want to be in regime 1. On the other hand, if Y is in regime 2, X wants to be in regime 2. Okay? 6, which isn't as good as would have been, is way better than 1. Okay? And of course, it's the same for the other way around. So if X happens to be in regime 1, Y wants to be playing regime 1 because 6 is greater than 2. But if X is playing regime 2, Y wants to be playing regime 2 because 10 is greater than 1. Okay? 10 is greater than 1. So this is a Nash equilibrium. if you ever get playing, if one of the players ever gets playing regime 2, the other player wants to play regime 2. On the other hand, this is also a Nash equilibrium. If one of the players starts to play regime 1, the other player wants to play regime 1. Now, we can see that player X would like to play regime 1. They would be lobbying and pushing for and using their power to try to come up and establish regime 1. Meanwhile, Y is going to be pushing for regime 2. Okay? But only one wins. And so this is our beta max versus our VHS. One wins. One gets the upper hand for some reason. Something happens. Okay? And this is probably some de facto power that comes to them because they're able to probably achieve some kind of collective action as a group and achieve a little bit of extra power and make some changes, and they flip to that regime, to that new regime. Once you're in that regime, now you're in that regime for a long time until you have somehow a lot of power to pull it out and actually get it something completely different reestablished. Because who's going to want to pull out of regime 1-1 as an equilibrium? Well, it's going to be X. So until X gets, it's Y that wants to pull out. So until Y gets sufficient power to be able to kind of turn over the entire system, you won't see any change. Okay. So this may be, and not all of the things that go on in that phase 1 of my previous diagram are coordination games, but many of them are. Because remember what North said, institutions form, he called them a matrix, an institutional matrix. So it isn't just one institution, it's a set of institutions that get established that cause this positive feedback to occur so that when one player is playing that regime, the other one says, yeah, okay, I don't like it, but I'll follow. Okay? I have an incentive to follow. And so you can get stuck in this regime for a very long period of time. Okay? By the way, just as if you did a standard problem. Let's see if I can do this. Let's just do a standard let's do, this is kind of a different coordination game, sort of a more standard one. This is not working. Whoops. I have no idea why it's not working. Oops. Sorry, folks. I've lost it. Okay. Here's your oops. It's back. Yay. Here's your standard coordination game. It might look something like this. So this is also a coordination game. There's two Nash equilibria. Here, there's no differential in power. Okay, one's clearly better than the other. Okay, both sides would be better off, and yet once you're in 4-4, it's going to be hard to move to the 10-10 because you have to remember we talked about this. You have to move everybody at the same time. You have to pack up everybody and. This is Sweden switching the sides of the road to get everybody doing it at the same time, and that's tough. Okay, so just so that you remember, getting out of these Nash equilibrium and coordination games is difficult. So, you might have this kind of thing in different regimes. This might be regime 1, this might be regime 2. You might get stuck in regime 2 where everybody's worse off. Okay? But typically, this is the kind of thing that you're seeing where one party under even a bad regime is better off. So, one example that I like to use in this context is take a country like Zimbabwe, where it's clear that there is one group of people that are doing very, very well. There's another group of people, most of the country, that's doing very, very poorly. So here, this regime 1, the X people, the people that are represented by X might be a very small minority of the population. And the people that are doing poorly might be a very large proportion of the population. And yet, once they're in that regime, it's very, very difficult to change it. Okay? And particularly then if these people have a lot of power, trying to switch to this regime would be is very, very difficult. And by the way, to take the example of Zimbabwe, everybody, there's this great elation back in the summer or fall when Mugabe stepped down, and then people are celebrating, thinking that the new regime might be different. And I was just talking to somebody from Zimbabwe earlier in the week, and all of those hopes are dashed, and things are back to where they were. This regime has continued to operate exactly as we would expect that it would. There's a set of institutions that are and norms that are present that just can't get dislodged by a simple change of one leader from another leader. Because why would they, right? So that's, I'm sorry, I can't go back to my earlier diagram, but that's the argument of Mo. Now, this diagram that I've just given you, let me fast forward now. This is also the argument for one of the other papers that we read. Which one? Anyone?
The argument about coordination is fairly similar to what Hardin talks about in relation to constitutions.
Yeah, this is really what Hardin is talking about in his constitutions paper. Did you want to say more about? Because you, I think, volunteered to say something about Hardin.
Yes. So Hardin, his whole view of constitutions is based on the fact that it to establish constitutions requires a massive act of coordination, and if that fails, then it is not subject to institutionalization and to processes of adaptive expectations and increasing returns. But at the start, he makes the argument that it is not in the interest of any other group to seek the worst outcome for another group, which holds true to that diagram there. Even if there are certain states that are better for one group and worse off, neither seeks the worst outcome there for the other group, because that would also imply a much worse outcome for them. If they want to get 1 for the other group, then they'd end up with a 2. It's what he says is related to David Hume's concept of acquiescence. Maybe that's getting a little bit too far.
No, keep going.
So essentially then, this coordination is possible because it is to mutual advantage to avoid conditions of lawlessness, essentially, and that could be viewed as what those bad outcomes there in that diagram are representing. And if specific rules do not coordinate actions, if they do not enable that to get to that state, then they do not become conventions in a constitutional regime. And this is all just for this is just for establishing government, and it does not necessarily apply to later acts of governance after that. Hardin says that specifically, that then different policy problems can take the form of different games, such as prisoners' dilemmas or cooperation games, but the initial act of establishing constitutions is necessarily coordination.
Yeah.
I think I was missing something there, but
No. Hang on. Okay. I think what you've outlined is exactly right. This diagram would also, this coordination game would also capture what Hardin is. There's much in Hardin, of course. So Hardin's also taking on this contractualist view, and so he's got part of this where he's saying this view of a social contract, of constitutions as social contracts. He doesn't think much of this view at all. He's very dismissive of this. He says we shouldn't think of this as people acting in a way to improve upon a kind of, if you like, a prisoner's dilemma type style situation, where if everybody was doing their own thing, they would end up in that cheat situation, but down in that corner, that Nash equilibrium that's not very good for anybody. And he said that contract view then assumes that the Constitution is going to take and benefit both people. Okay, and so there's actually a nice connection for those, just so you can see this, between what Hardin was saying the contract people were arguing, and what Mose was saying that the economists were arguing. The contract people and the economists were making essentially the same argument, that it's all about moving from this situation where players are in a suboptimal situation to something where they're both better off. Okay, and Hardin says this is nonsense. This is not what constitutions do. Okay, they aren't necessarily benefiting both players, and there's no sense of an agreement, and some sense that if you didn't have this, that you'd fall back on some other alternative that you could, some sort of threat point. That's not the right way to think about the problem at all. Rather, this is what he's thinking about, that the Constitution sets up a set of rules, of norms of behavior, ways of running government. And we can think of these as rules 1 and rules 2. Okay? And if you happen to choose rules 2, then one group of people under those rules is going to do pretty well, and the other one's not going to do so well. And if you choose the other set of rules, vice versa. But once you've chosen that set of rules, and people start to behave like this, and start to reinforce those, then even though you don't like it, and in his term that he actually borrows from Hume, is people will simply acquiesce. So you can think about, let's talk about X in this game. Under regime 1, X doesn't do very well. They get 6. Their counterparts, sorry, that's not right. Y doesn't do very well. They only get 6. X gets 10. Okay. Y would like to see this changed. Okay. But unless they can change the whole rules, unless it isn't that Y wants to change the rules unilaterally, because if they change the rules unilaterally, they're down here, and Y gets 2 instead of 6. That's what happens when they change the rules unilaterally. Does everybody see that? So if Y changes the rules unilaterally, they move from getting 6 which they don't particularly like because it's worse than 10. But if they change the rules unilaterally and move to regime 2, they get 2. So they say, I got to stay. I don't like it. What they'd really like to do is change the rules to and have X change at the same time. That's what they want. But that requires everybody to change. And that's Hardin's point. That's what constitutions are. Okay? So he has this, and I think it's a really good example, the Electoral College in the US. A lot of people upset with the Electoral College, both in 2000 when Gore got more popular vote than did Bush, and yet didn't win the Electoral College. And then the most recent election when Clinton got more votes but didn't win the Electoral College, and so Trump took over. Okay? Both cases, there's a whole group of people that are really PO'd about that situation, like really upset. And yet, you haven't seen revolution break out on the streets of the United States over changing the Electoral College. Why? Because it's a part of a package of a set of norms that people understand if they break that without changing the entire thing, it's not going to be very good for them. So constitutions are, in fact, part of that way that the initial power is allocated. So who was it that asked me about how does that power get established? How do those institutions get formed? Well, you can think about those. This is why these constitutional phases are really important, because they set up who essentially gets that initial power, and that's really critical because that tends to then be baked into the system from then on. Okay, and I think that this is where it's time to quit. It really is time to quit. That this is where the situations, the policies that we're seeing enacted today are coming from. It's coming from these institutional and power forces that were at work in the past. It's not from these nice rational things that Arrow is asking about and that Coase is asking about. It's from this dynamic that's in place as people are struggling to get their ideas into place. Let me leave it at that, and we'll see you next week. We're over time, so next week. Okay? But yes, we need to talk about the final and the term paper next week. Yeah, I do. They're in my office. No. Let's go do that. I meant to bring them in. So.
You can't even get access to the agenda. You can get access to the office. That is has to be done. That's how our community is so intolerant. Is that kind of thing,
Well. So basically, and then going back to the definition of institution, it's because I really want to do the assignment. Like, I really want to do it well, Because the first one, it was very bad. I really need a good one this time. But so, is that like you are taking one of these things, like one institution, like the law enforcement or whatever? Or gender equality, that will be an institution?
Sure. I think you can choose pretty much
I'm not really sure I understand it.
Is it one of them like large startup costs or something? Like,
The first one.
anything that's difficult to do.
Yeah, like
Just
the amount of money it takes to set up a constitution is incredible because you have to have meetings and you have to get everyone to agree and then you have to decide what does that constitution do. Well,
So what he expects is like, for example, let's take that idea of how to change constitutions. Let's take the Venezuelan case now.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, I wish you
So-
had an example, but that'd be fascinating.
That would be really.
It's a classic state.
But then that would be like the assignment would be like that. Like for example, take that example and saying, okay, so this is what's happening in Venezuela and changing the constitution is facing all these questions, all these
I
costs.
haven't actually read that.
I just read it,
But
but I
like,
forget what it all says.
You know, but applying to like what you're doing with refugees, like that could be so large setup for fixed costs to change. What does it mean to be a refugee? How do you define a refugee? How does a refugee change status? Like that's a huge part of why we're having so many problems now with adapting to people like trying to come to different countries, right?
But this is from the state point of view, or from the institution's point of view, or from the people point of view.
I think this one, like if you're using like for the constitution, like to me that would be the state.
Yeah, and if
Yeah,
I do
for
it
the
from
state to
the
change that institution.
or for example, from the refugee point of view,
Yeah.
that will be from the person as well. Like how leaving my country, you know, like
Yeah.
leaving my country because I have been persecuted or something. And then what's the institution there? Like the
To
forced
me-
migration?
To me,
Or
it
the-
could be, yeah, forced migration. To me, it could be, like you were saying before, citizenship, borders, identity. Like, there's so many different things that are going on there.
And then after, because I read this scene like state, and the whole point of view of the book is that, like,